Oh,
That was their purpose.
I don't know.
Okay.
So for those of you watching online, in years past, I've done an unabridged reading, which takes about 3 hours. This evening, I'm trying something different for the first time. When Dickens himself did public readings, he had an abridged version that he did that took a little under an hour because he found that audiences couldn't tolerate him much longer than that. So I've taken his abridged version and put back in a few of the things that he left out that I particularly love. So without further ado, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, published 175 years ago on Thursday. Stave 1, Marley's Ghost. Marley was dead to begin with. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge himself signed it. And Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined, by myself, to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of the ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically, old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead? Well, of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for, well, I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, and his sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event, except that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come from the story I'm going to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night in an easterly wind on his own ramparts than there would any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot, say St. Paul's Churchyard, for instance, literally to astonish his son's rather weak mind. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood, years afterwards, above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. Well, the firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge, and sometimes Marley. But he answered both names. It was all the same to him. Ah, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose and shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head, and on his eyebrows, and on his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperatures about with him. He iced his office in the dog days, and didn't thaw at 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose. No pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely. Scrooge never did. Nobody ever stopped him on the street to say, with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than a dark eye. Better than an evil eye, Dark Master." What did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked. To edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathies to keep their distance, was what the knowing ones called nuts to Scrooge. Well, once upon a time, of all the good days of the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting, foggy weather, and the city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open, that he might keep an eye on his clerk, who, in a dismal little cell beyond, sort of a tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room. And so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle, God save you," came a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation Scrooge had of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug! Christmas a humbug, Uncle? You don't mean it, I'm sure." "I do. Out upon Merry Christmas. What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money, a time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer, a time for balancing your books and having every item on them through a round dozen of months presented dead against you? If I had my will, every idiot who goes around with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled in his own pudding, buried with a stake of holly through his heart, he should. Uncle, nephew, keep Christmas in your own way, let me keep it in mine." "Keep it? But you don't keep it." "Let me leave it alone, then. Much good may it do you. Much good has it ever done you." "There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say. Christmas among the rest. But I'm sure I've always thought of Christmas time, when it came around, apart from the veneration due to its sacred origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem, by one consent, to open up their shut-up hearts freely and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow travelers to the grave and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, Uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good and will do me good, and I say God bless it." The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. "Let me hear another sound from you," said Scrooge, "and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a powerful speaker, sir," he added, turning to his nephew. "I wonder you don't go into Parliament." "Don't be angry, Uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow." Scrooge said he would see him. Yes, indeed he did. He went the whole length of the expression. He said that he would see him in that extremity first. "But why?" cried Scrooge's nephew. "Why?" "Why did you get married?" "Because I fell in love." "Because you fell in love," growled Scrooge, as if that were the only thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas. "Good afternoon." "Nay, Uncle, but you never came to see me before that happened. Why give it as a reason for not coming now?" "Good afternoon." "I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends?" "Good afternoon." "I am sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute. We have never had any quarrel to which I have been a party. But I have made the trial in homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humor to the last. So, a Merry Christmas, Uncle." "Good afternoon." "And a Happy New Year." "Good afternoon." His nephew left the room without an angry word, notwithstanding. The clerk, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands and bowed to him. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years. He died 7 years ago, this very night." "At this festival season of the year, Mr. Scrooge," said the gentleman, taking up a pen, "it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provisions for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, sir." "Are there no prisons?" "Plenty of prisons, but under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the unoffending multitude, a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?" "Nothing." "Oh, you wish to be anonymous." "I wish to be left alone. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the prisons and the workhouses. They cost enough. And those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die. If they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population." At length, the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge, dismounting from his stool, tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly stuffed his candle out and put on his hat. "You'll want the whole day tomorrow, I suppose?" "If quite convenient, sir." "It is not convenient, and it's not fair. If I was to stop half a crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound." "Yes, sir." "And yet you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work." "It's only once a year, sir." "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier next morning." The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no greatcoat, went down a slide at the end of a lane of boys 20 times, in honor of it being Christmas Eve, and then ran home as hard as he could pelt, to play at Blindman's Buff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's books, went home to read. He lived in bedchambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms in a lowering pile of buildings up a yard. The building was old enough now and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms being let out as offices. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door of this house except that it was very large. Also, that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence in the place. Also, that Scrooge had as little as what's called fancy about him as any of the men in London. And yet, Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face, with a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but it looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up upon his ghostly forehead. As Scrooge looked fixedly at the phenomenon, it was a knocker again. He said, "Pooh, pooh," and closed the door with a bang. The noise resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellar below appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs. Slowly, too, trimming his candle as he went. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for its being very dark. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, a small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and the little saucepan of gruel. Scrooge had a cold on his head, upon the hob. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual, old fire guard, old shoes, 2 fish baskets, washing stand on 3 legs and a poker. Quite satisfied, he closed the door and locked himself in, double locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprises, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap, and sat down before the very low fire to make his gruel. As he threw his head back in the chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell, that hung in the room and communicated, for some purpose now forgotten, with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment, and with a strange, inexplicable dread, that as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. Soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This was succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Then he heard the noise much louder on floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight toward his door. It came on through the heavy door, and a spectre passed into the room before his eyes, and upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up, as though it cried, "I know him! Marley's ghost!" The same face, the very same. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights, and boots. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him, and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he had never believed it until now. No, nor did he believe it even now. Though he looked the phantom through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes and noticed the very texture of the folded kerchief bound around its head and chin, he was still incredulous. "How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much." Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you then?" "In life I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" "I can." "Do it then." Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find him in a condition to take a chair, and felt that in the event of its being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down opposite him across the fireplace from him as if he were quite used to it. "You don't believe in me." "I don't." "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses?" "I don't know." "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are." Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be smart as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his horror. How much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage around its head, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped upon its breast. "Mercy, dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me? Why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?" It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide, and if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is content to do so after death. I cannot tell you all I would. A very little more is permitted me. I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me, in life, my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me. 7 years dead, traveling all that time. You travel fast. On the wings of the wind. You might have got over a great quantity of ground in 7 years. Oh, blind man, not to know that ages of incessant labor by immortal creatures, for this earth may pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all developed. Not to know that any spirit working kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amend for one life's opportunity misused. Yet I was this man. I once was this man. But you were always a good man of business, Jacob, faltered Scrooge, who had now begun to apply this to himself. Business! Cried the ghost, wringing his hands again. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly. Hear me! My time is nearly gone. I will, but don't be hard on me. Don't be flowery, Jacob, pray. I'm here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate. A chance and hope of my procuring, Ebenezer. You were always a good friend to me. Thank you. You will be haunted by 3 spirits. Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob? I think I'd rather not. Without their visits, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow night when the bell tolls 1. Expect the second on the next night at the same hour. The third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that for your own sake you remember what has passed between us. It walked backward from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that, when the apparition reached it, it was wide open. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double locked as he had locked it with his own hands. The bolts were undisturbed. Scrooge tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable. And being, from the emotion he had undergone, or the fatigues of the day, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, he went straight to bed without undressing, and fell asleep on the instant. Stave 2, the first of the 3 spirits. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber, until suddenly the church clock tolled a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy 1. Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn aside by a strange figure, like a child, yet not so much like a child as an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from view and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung down its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and, in singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light, by which all of this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its duller moments, a great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm. "Are you the spirit whose coming was foretold me?" "I am." "Who and what are you?" "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" "No, your past. The things that you will see with me are shadows of the things that have been. They will have no consciousness of us." Scrooge then made bold to inquire what business brought him there. "Your welfare. Rise and walk with me." It would have been vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that bed was warm and the thermometer a long way below freezing, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown and nightcap, and that he had a cold upon him at that time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, but finding that the spirit made toward the window, clasped his robe in supplication. "I am mortal and liable to fall." "Bear but a touch of my hand. There," said the spirit, laying it upon his heart, "and you shall be upheld in more than this." As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood in the busy thoroughfares of a city. It was made plain enough by the dressings of the shops that here too it was Christmas time. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it. "Know it? Was I apprenticed there?" They went in. At the sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been 2 inches taller he must have knocked his head against the ceiling, Scrooge cried out in his excitement, "Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart, it's Fezziwig alive again!" Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself, from his shoes to his organ of benevolence, and called out in a comfortable, oily, fat, rich, jovial voice, "Yo-ho there! Ebenezer! Dick!" A living and moving picture of Scrooge's former self, a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow prentice. "Dick Wilkins, to be sure," said Scrooge to the ghost. "My old fellow prentice. Bless me, yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick, dear, dear." "Yo-ho, my boys," said Fezziwig. "No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up before a man can say Jack Robinson. Clear away, my lads, and have lots of room here." Clear away. There was nothing they wouldn't have cleared away, or couldn't have cleared away, with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off as if it were dismissed from public life forevermore. The floor was swept and watered, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright a ballroom as you could desire to see on a winter's night. In came a fiddler with a music book, and went up to the lofty desk and made an orchestra of it, and tuned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook with her brother's particular friend, the milkman. In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came, anyhow and everyhow. Away they all went, 20 couples at once. Hands around back and back again the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping. Old top couple always turning up in the wrong place. New top couple starting off again as soon as they got there. All top couples at last, not a bottom one to help them. When this result was brought about, old Fezziwig, clapping his hands to stop the dance, cried out, "Well done!" And the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter, especially provided for that purpose. There were more dances, and there were forfeits, and more dances, and there was cake, and there was negus, And there was a great piece of cold roast, and there was a great piece of cold boiled, and there were mince pies and plenty of beer. But the great effect of the evening came after the roast and boiled, when the fiddler struck up Sir Roger de Coverley. Fezziwig stood up to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. Top couple, too, with a good stiff piece of work cut out for them. 2 or 3, 3 or 4 and 20 pair of partners, people who were not to be trifled with, people who would dance and had no notion of walking. But if they had been twice as many, 4 times, old Fezziwig would have been a match for them, and so would Mrs. Fezziwig. As to her, she was worthy to be his partner in every sense of the term. A positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves. They shone in every part of the dance. You couldn't have predicted, at any given time, what would become of them next. And when old Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had gone all through the dance, advance and retire, turn your partner, bow and curtsy, corkscrew, thread the needle, and back again to your place, Fezziwig cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his legs. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person, individually, as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired but the 2 prentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which were under the counter in the backstop. A small matter, said the ghost, to make these silly folk so full of gratitude. He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise? It isn't that, said Scrooge, heated by the remark, and speaking unconsciously like his former, not his latter self. It isn't that, Spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. Say that his power lies in words and looks, in things so slight and insignificant that it is impossible to add and count them up. What then? The happiness he gives us is quite as great as if it cost a fortune. He felt the spirit's glance and stopped. What's the matter? Nothing particular. Something, I think. No. I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now, that's all. My time grows short, observed the spirit. This was not addressed to Scrooge, or to anyone which he could see, but it produced an immediate effect, for once again he saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of life. He was not alone, but sat at the side of a fair young girl in a black dress, in whose eyes there were tears. It matters little, she said softly to Scrooge's former self. To you, very little. Another idol has displaced me. And if it can comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve. What idol has displaced you? A golden one. You fear the world too much. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off, one by one, until the master passion, gain, engrosses you. Have I not? What then? Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? I'm not changed towards you. Have I ever sought release from our engagement? In words, no, never. In what then? In a changed nature, in an altered spirit, in another atmosphere of life, another hope as its great end. If you were free today, tomorrow, yesterday, can even I believe that you would choose a dowerless girl, or, choosing her, do I not know that your repentance and regret would surely follow? I do, and I release you with a full heart for the love of him you once were. Spirit, remove me from this place! But the relentless ghost pinioned him in both his arms and forced him to observe what happened next. They were in another scene and place. A room, not very large or handsome, but full of comfort. Near to the winter fire sat a beautiful young girl, so like the last that Scrooge believed it was the same until he saw her, now a comely matron, sitting opposite her daughter. The noise in this room was perfectly tumultuous. For there were more children here than Scrooge in his agitated state of mind could count. And unlike the celebrated herd in the poem, they were not 40 children conducting themselves like one, but every child was conducting themselves like 40. The consequences were uproarious beyond belief, but no one seemed to care. On the contrary, the mother and daughter laughed heartily and enjoyed it very much, and the latter, soon beginning to mingle in the spirits, got pillaged by the young brigands most ruthlessly. What would I have not given to be one of them? Though I never could have been so rude. No, I wouldn't for all the wealth in the world have crushed that braided hair and torn it down. And for the precious little shoe, I wouldn't have plucked it off, God bless my soul, to save my life. And to measure her waist in sport, as they did, bold young brood, I couldn't have done it. I should have expected my arm to grow round it for a punishment and never come straight again. And yet, I should have dearly liked, I do own, to have touched her lips, to have questioned her, that she might have opened them and looked upon the lashes of her downcast eyes and never raised a blush, to have let those loose waves of hair, an inch of which would be a keepsake beyond price. In short, I would have liked, I do confess, to have had the lightest license of a child, and yet be man enough to know its value. And now a knocking at the door was heard, and such a rush immediately ensued that she, with a laughing face and plundered dress, was borne toward it in the center of a flushed and boisterous group, just in time to greet the father, who came home, attended by a man laden with Christmas toys and presents. Then the shouting and struggling, and the onslaught that was made on the defenseless porter, the scaling him with chairs for ladders, to dive into his pockets, despoil him of brown paper parcels, hold on tight by his cravat, hug him around his neck, pommel his back, and kick his legs in irrepressible affection. The shouts of wonder and delight by which the development of every package was received. The terrible announcement that the baby had been taken in the act of putting a doll's frying pan into his mouth and was more than suspected of having swallowed a fictitious turkey glued onto a wooden platter. The immense relief of finding this a false alarm. The joy and gratitude and ecstasy, they were all indescribable alike. It is enough that by degrees the children and their emotions got out of the parlor, and by one stair at a time to the top of the house, where they went to bed and so subsided. And now Scrooge looked on more attentively than ever, when the master of the house, having his daughter leaning fondly on him, sat down with her and her mother at his own fireside, and when he thought that such another creature, quite as graceful and as full of promise, might have called him father, and been a springtime in the haggard winter of his life, his sight grew very dim indeed. "Belle," said the husband, turning to his wife with a smile, "I saw an old friend of yours this afternoon." "Who was it?" "Guess." "How can I?" "Tut, don't I know?" she added in the same breath, laughing as he laughed. "Mr. Scrooge!" Mr. Scrooge it was. I passed his office window, and as it was not shut up and he had a candle inside, I could scarcely help seeing him. His partner lies on the point of death, I hear, and there he sat alone. Quite alone in the world, I do believe. "Spirit," said Scrooge in a broken voice, "remove me from this place." "I told you these were shadows of the things that have been," said the ghost. "They are what they are. Do not blame me." "Remove me!" Scrooge exclaimed. "I cannot bear it." He turned upon the ghost, and seeing that it looked upon him with a face in which, in some strange way, there were fragments of all the faces it had shown him, wrestled with it. As he struggled with the spirit, he was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and further, of being in his own bedroom. He barely had time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. Stave 3, the second of the three spirits. Scrooge awoke in his bedroom. There was no doubt about that. But it and its own adjoining sitting room, in which he shuffled into in his slippers, attracted by a great light there, had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceilings were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove. The leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light, as if many little mirrors had been scattered there, and such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney, as that petrifaction of a hearth had not known in Scrooge's time, or Marley's, or for many and many a winter season gone. Heaped upon the floor, to form a kind of throne, were turkeys, geese, game, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oyster, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12th cakes and great bowls of punch, and several pineapples. In easy state upon this couch there sat a giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch, in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and who raised it high to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping around the door. Come in and know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas present. Look upon me. You've never seen the like of me before. Never. Have never walked forth with the younger members of my family, meaning, for I'm very young, my elder brothers born in these late years, pursued the Phantom. I don't think I have. I'm afraid I have not. Have you had many brothers, Spirit? More than 1,800. A tremendous family to provide for. Spirit, conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, for I learned a lesson which is working on me now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it. Touch my robe. Scrooge did as he was told and held it fast. The room and its contents all vanished instantly, and they stood in the city streets upon a snowy Christmas morning. Scrooge and the ghost passed on, invisible, straight to Scrooge's clerks. And on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinklings of his torch. Think of that. Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his four-roomed house. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, brave in ribbons, which are cheap but make a goodly show for sixpence. And she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, and getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar, Bob's private property, conferred upon his son and heir in honor of the day, into his mouth, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in the fashionable parts. And now the two smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelled the goose, and known it for their own, and basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion. These young Cratchits danced about the table, and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud, although his collars nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes bubbling up knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. Whatever has got your precious father, then? Said Mrs. Cratchit. And your brother Tiny Tim and Martha weren't as late last Christmas Day by half an hour. Here's Martha, mother, said a girl, appearing as she spoke. Here's Martha, mother, cried two young Cratchits. Hurrah! There's such a goose, Martha! Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are, said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her. We'd a deal of work to finish up last night, replied the girl. I had to clear away this morning, mother. Well, never mind, so long as you've come, said Mrs. Cratchit. Sit ye down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm, Lord bless ye. No, there's father coming, cried the two young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. Hide, Martha, hide! So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fringe, hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking round. "Not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming," said Bob, with a sudden declension of his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from church, and come home rampant. "Not coming upon Christmas Day?" Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only in joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the other two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off to the wash-house, that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "And how did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, when she had rallied Bob on his credulity, and Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you've ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people at church saw him in the church, because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant for them to remember, upon Christmas Day, who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool beside the fire, and while Bob, turning up his cuffs as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made to look more shabby, compounded some hot mixture with a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy, ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the apple sauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him into a tiny corner of the table. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their post, crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn come to be helped. At last, the dishes were set on and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, proceeded to plunge it into the breast. And when she did so, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all round the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size, and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't even ate it all at last. Yet everyone had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onions to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Supposing it should not be done enough, supposing it should break in turning out, supposing somebody should have gotten over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose, a supposition at which the young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hallo, a great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like washing day, that was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress next door to that was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck into the top. Oh, a wonderful pudding. Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind, she would confess that she had had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it. But nobody said or thought that it was all a small pudding for a large family. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up, the compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect. Apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchits drew around the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff in the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire spluttered and crackled noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to all, my dear. God bless us." To which all the family re-echoed, "God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side, upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved his child, and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. Scrooge raised his head suddenly on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, "I give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of this feast." "The founder of this feast, indeed," cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here to give him a tiny piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, "the children, Christmas Day." "It should be Christmas Day, I'm sure," said she, "on which one drinks the health of such a odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day." "I'll drink his health for your sake and the day's," said Mrs. Cratchit, "not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. He'll be merry, very happy, I have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had had no heartiness about it. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care tuppence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for a full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before. From the mere relief of Scrooge the Baleful being done with, Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6pence weekly. The 2 young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investment he should favor when he come into the receipt of that bewildering sum of money. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, then told them what kind of work she had to do and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest. Tomorrow being a holiday, she passed at home. Also, how she had seen a countess and a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter, at which Peter pulled up his collar so high you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. All this time the chestnuts in the jug went round and round, and by they had a song about a lost child travelling in the snow from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice and sang it very well. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, as this scene vanished, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing, smiling by his side and looking at that same nephew. It is a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things, that while there is infection and disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor. When Scrooge's nephew laughed, Scrooge's niece, by marriage, laughed as heartily as he. And the assembled friends, not being a bit behindhand, laughed out lustily. "He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live," cried Scrooge's nephew. "He believed it, too." "More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece, indignantly. Bless those women. They never do anything by halves. They're always in earnest. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed. As no doubt it was. All kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head. Altogether, she's what you would have called provoking, but satisfactory too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. "He's a comical old fellow," said Scrooge's nephew. "That's the truth. And not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offenses carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him. Who suffers by his ill wills? Himself, always. Here, he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? Well, he doesn't lose much of a dinner." "Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner," interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everyone else said the same, as they must be allowed to have been competent judges because they had just had dinner, and with the dessert upon the table were clustered about the fire by lamplight. "Well, I'm very glad to hear it," said Scrooge's nephew, "because I haven't any great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper?" Topper clearly had his eye on one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject. Whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. After tea they had some music, for they were a musical family, and knew what they were about when they sung a glee or a catch, I can assure you. Especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a good one, and never swell the large veins in his forehead or get red in the face over it. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while they played at forfeits, for it is good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. There was first a game of blind man's buff, though, and I no more believe that Topper was really blinded than I believe that he had eyes in his boots. Because the way in which he went after that plump sister in the lace tucker was an outrage to the credulity of human nature. Knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping up against the piano, smothering himself behind the curtains. Wherever she went, there he was. He always knew where the plump sister was. He wouldn't catch anybody else. If you had fallen up against him, as some of them did, and stood there, he would have made a feint at endeavoring to seize you, which would have been an affront to your understanding, and would instantly have sidled off in the direction of the plump sister. "Here's a new game," said Scrooge. "1 half-hour, Spirit, only one." It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what, he only answering to their questions yes or no, as the case was. The fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, rather a disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes and talked sometimes, and lived in London and walked about the streets and wasn't made a show of and wasn't led by anybody and didn't live in a menagerie and was never killed in a market and was not a horse or an ass or a cow or a bull or a tiger or a dog or a pig or a cat or a bear. At every new question put to him, this nephew burst out in a fresh roar of laughter and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last, the plump sister cried out, I found it out. I know what it is, Fred. I know what it is. What is it? Cried Fred. It's your Uncle Scrooge! Which it certainly was. Admiration was the sentiment, though some objected that the reply to, is it a bear, ought to have been yes. Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so happy and light of heart that he would have drank to the unconscious company in an inaudible speech, but the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last word spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were once again upon their travels. Much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited. But always with a happy end. The spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful, on foreign lands, and they were close at home, by struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope, by poverty, and they were rich, in almshouse, hospital, and jail, in misery's every refuge, where vain men, in his little brief authority, had not made fast the door and barred the spirit out. He left his blessing and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, if it were only a night. But Scrooge had his doubts of this, because the Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into a space of time they passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it until they left a children's Twelfth Night party. When looking at the spirit as they stood together in an open place, he noticed that its hair was grey. Are spirits' lives so short? Asked Scrooge. My life upon this globe is very brief, replied the ghost. It ends tonight. Tonight? Cried Scrooge. Tonight at midnight. Hark, the time is drawing near. The chimes were ringing 11:15 at that moment. Forgive me, if I'm not justified in what I ask, said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe. But I see something strange and not belonging to you protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw? It might be a claw, for all the flesh there is upon it, was the spirit's sorrowful reply. Look here. From the folding of its robe, it brought forth two children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at his feet and clung upon the outside of his garments. Oh, man, look here, look down here, exclaimed the ghost. They were a boy and a girl, yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, wolfish, prostrate too, in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints, a stale and shriveled hand like that of old age had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacingly. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade. Through all the miseries of wonderful creation has monsters half so horrible and dread. Scrooge stared back, appalled. Having them shown to him in this way, he tried to say they were fine children, but the words choked themselves rather than be parties to the lie of such enormous magnitude. Spirit? Are they yours? Scrooge could say no more. They are man's, said the spirit, looking down upon them, and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance. This girl is want. Beware them both, in all of their degree, but most of all beware this boy. For on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased. Deny it, cried the spirit, stretching out his hand towards the city. Slander those who tell it ye. Admit it for your factious purposes and make it worse, and bide the end. Have they no refuge or resource? Cried Scrooge. Are there no prisons? Said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. Are there no workhouses? The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about himself for the ghost and saw it no more. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist across the ground toward him.
How many people?
How many people? There are only 3 people there.
Probably the same 3.
And we have Greg Stein and we have Chris Thistlethwaite, and I don't know who the other person is.
But it's probably Erin. Erin, are you on there?
I've asked her, she's not answering.
Okay.
I think she's turned her
She's
phone
listening to
off
the story.
to be polite, but she's listening to the story.
All right. Stave 4, the last of the spirits. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came near him, Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the air through which the spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of its visible save one outstretched hand. He knew no more, for the spirit neither spoke nor moved. I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come, ghost of the future. I fear you more than any spectre I have seen, but as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear you company, and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me? It gave him no reply. The hand was pointed straight before them. Lead on, lead on. The night is waning fast, and it is precious time to me, I know. Lead on, spirit. They scarcely seemed to enter the city, for rather the city sprung up about them. But they were in the heart of it, on change, amongst the merchants. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen. Observing that the hand was pointed to them, Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk. No, said a great fat man with a monstrous chin. I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead. When did he die? Inquired another. Last night, I believe. Why? What was the matter with him? I thought he'd never die. God knows, said the first with a yawn. What has he done with his money? Asked a red-faced gentleman. I haven't heard, said the man with the large chin. Company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me. That's all I know. Bye-bye. Scrooge was at first inclined to be surprised that the spirit should attach importance to a conversation so apparently trivial. But feeling assured that it must have some hidden purpose, he set himself to consider what it was likely to be. It could scarcely be supposed to have any bearing on the death of Jacob, his old partner, for that was past, and this ghost province was the future. He looked about in that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner. And though the clock pointed to his usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that poured in through the porch. It gave him little surprise, however, for he had been revolving in his mind a change of life, and he thought and hoped he saw this newborn resolution carried out in this. They left the busy scene and went into an obscure part of the town, to a low shop where iron, old rags, bottles, bones, and greasy offal were brought. A grey-haired rascal of great age sat smoking his pipe. Scrooge and the Phantom came into the presence of this man just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop, and she had scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in too, and she was closely followed by a man in faded black. After a short period of blank astonishment, in which the old man with his pipe had joined them, they all 3 burst out into a laugh. "Let the charwoman be alone to be the first," cried she who had entered first. "Let the laundress alone to be the second, and let the undertaker's man alone to be the third. Look here, old Joe, here's a chance, if we haven't all 3 met here without meaning it." "You couldn't have met in a better place. You were made free of it long ago, you know, and the other two aren't strangers. What have you got to sell? What have you got to sell? Half a minute's patience, Joe, and you shall see. What odds then? What odds, Mrs. Dibbler? Said the woman. Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did. Who's the worse for the loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose. Mrs. Dibbler, whose manner was remarkable for general propitiation, said, No, indeed, ma'am. If he wanted to keep him after he was dead, a wicked old screw, why wasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had been, he'd have had somebody to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying gasping out the last there all alone by hisself. It's the truest word that ever was spoke. It's a judgment on him. I wish it was an heavier judgment. It should have been, you may depend upon it. If I could have laid my hands on anything else. Open that bundle, old Joe, and let me know the value of it. Speak out plain. I'm not afraid to be the first, nor afraid for them to see it. Joe went down on his knees for the greater convenience of opening the bundle, and dragged out a large and heavy roll of some dark stuff. What you call this? Bed curtains? Aye, bed curtains. Don't drop that oil upon the blankets now. His blankets? Whose else do you think? He isn't likely to take cold without him, I dare say. You may look through that shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find an hole in it. Not a threadbare place. It's the best he had, and a fine one, too. They'd have wasted it by dressing him up in it if it hadn't been for me. Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror. Spirit, I see. The case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now. Merciful heaven, what is this? The scene had changed, and now he almost touched a bare, uncurtained bed. A pale light, rising in the outer air, fell straight upon this bed, and on it, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of this plundered, unknown man. If there's any person in this town who feels emotion caused by this man's death, said Scrooge, quite agonized, show that person to me, Spirit, I beseech you. The phantom spread its dark robe before him for a moment like a wing, and withdrawing it, revealed a room by daylight, where a mother and her children were. She was expecting someone, and with anxious eagerness, for she walked up and down the room, starting at every sound, looking out from the window, glancing at the clock, tried, but in vain, to work with her needle, and could hardly bear the voices of the children in their play. At length, the long-expected knock was heard. She hurried to the door and met her husband, a man whose face was careworn and depressed, although he was young. There was a remarkable expression now in it, a kind of serious delight of which he felt ashamed, and which he struggled to repress. He sat down to the dinner that had been hoarding for him by the fire, and when she asked him faintly what news, which was not until after a long silence, he appeared embarrassed how to answer. Is it good, she said, or bad, to help him? Bad, he answered. We're quite ruined. No, there's hope yet, Carolyn. If he relents, she said, amazed, there is. Nothing is past hope if such a miracle has happened. He's past relenting, said her husband. He's dead. She was a mild and patient creature, if her face spoke truth. But she was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so with clasped hands. She prayed forgiveness at the next moment, and was sorry, but the first was the emotion of her heart. What the half-drunken woman who I told you of last night said to me, when I tried to see him and obtain a week's delay, and what I thought was a mere excuse to avoid me, turns out to have been quite true. He was not only very ill, but dying then. To whom will our debt be transferred? Well, I don't know, but before that time, we should be ready with the money. And even though we were not, it would be bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor in his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Carolyn. Yes. Soften it as they would, their hearts were lighter. The children's faces, hushed and clustered round to hear what they so little understood, were brighter, and it was a happier house for this man's death. The only emotion the ghost would show him, caused by the events, was one of pleasure. Spirit, let me see some tenderness connected with a death, or that dark chamber, spirit, will be forever present to me. The ghost conducted him again to poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated round the fire. Quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner, and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in needlework, but surely they were very quiet. And he took a child and set him in the midst of them. Where had Scrooge heard those words? He had not dreamed them. The boy must have read them, as he and the spirit crossed the threshold. Why did he not go on? The mother laid her work upon the table and put a hand to her face. The colour hurts my eyes, she said. The colour. Poor Tiny Tim. They're better now again. It makes them weak by candlelight. I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home, for the world. It must be near his time. Past it, rather, Peter answered, shutting up his book. But I think he's walked a little slower than he used these past few evenings, Mother. I've known him to walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulders very fast indeed. Oh, so have I, cried Peter, often. And so have I, exclaimed another. So had all. But he was very light to carry, and father loved him so. It was no trouble, no trouble. And there's your father at the door. She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob in his comforter. He had need of it, poor fellow, came in. His tea was ready for him upon the hob, and they all tried who should help him the most to it. Then the two young Cratchits got on his knees and laid each child a little cheek against his face, as if he said, Don't mind me, father, don't be grieved. Bob was very cheerful with them, and spoke pleasantly to all the family. He looked at the work upon the table and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said. Sunday? You went today then, Robert? Yes, my dear, returned Bob. I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday. My little child, my little child. He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it, but if he could have helped it, he and his child would have been farther apart, perhaps, than they were. Spectre, said Scrooge. Something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. I know it, but I know not how. Tell me what man that was, with the covered face, whom he saw lying dead. The ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed him to a dismal, wretched, ruinous churchyard. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of things that will be, or the shadows of things that may be only? Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which he stood. Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends to which, if persevered in, they must lead. But if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it's thus with what you show me. The spirit was immovable as ever. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. Am I that man that will lay upon the bed? No, spirit, no, spirit, hear me. I'm not the man I was. I'm not the man I must have been but for this intercourse. Why show me this if I'm past all hope? Assure me that I may change these shadows you have shown me by an altered life. For the first time, the kind hand faltered. I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Tell me Tell me I may sponge away the writing on this stone. Holding up his hands in one last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down to a bedpost. Yes, and the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own to make amends in. He was checked in his transports by the churches ringing out in the lusty peals he had ever heard. Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head. No fog, no mist, no night. Clear, bright, stirring, golden day. "What's today?" cried Scrooge, calling down to a boy in Sunday clothes, who perhaps had loitered in to look around. "Eh? What's today, my fine fellow?" "Today? Why, Christmas Day." "It's Christmas Day. I haven't missed it. Hello, my fine fellow. Hello? Do you know the Poulterers? In the next street by one, at the corner?" "I should hope I did." An intelligent boy, a remarkable boy. "Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there? Not the little prize turkey, the big one." "What, the one as big as me?" What a delightful boy. It's a pleasure to talk to him. "Yes, my buck." "It's hanging there now." Is it? Is it? Go and buy it." "Walker!" exclaimed the boy. No, I'm in earnest. Go and buy it. Tell him to bring it back here that I may give them the direction where to take it. Come back with the man, I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes, I'll give you half a crown. The boy was off like a shot. "I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's. He shan't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim. Joe Miller never made such a joke as sending it to Bob will be." The hand in which he wrote the address was not a steady one, but wrote it he did, somehow, and went downstairs to open the street door, ready for the coming of the Poulterer's man. It was a turkey. He would never have stood upon its legs, that bird. He would have snapped them off short in a minute, like sticks of sealing wax. Scrooge dressed himself, all in his best, and at last got out into the streets. The people were by this time pouring forth, as he had seen them with the ghost of Christmas present, and walking with his hands behind him, Scrooge regarded every one with a delighted smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant, in a word, that 3 or 4 good-humoured fellows said, "Good morning, sir, and Merry Christmas to you." And Scrooge then said often afterwards that of all the blithe sounds he had ever heard, these were the blithest in his ears. In the afternoon, he turned his steps toward his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock. But he made a dash, and he did it. "Is your master at home, my dear?" said the Scrooge to the girl. Nice girl, very. "Yes, sir." "Where is he, my love?" "He's in the dining room, sir, with his mistress." "He knows me," said Scrooge, with his hand already on the dining room lock. "I'll go in there, my dear." "Fred?" "Why, bless my soul," cried Fred. "Who's that?" "It is I, your Uncle Scrooge." "I've come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred?" Let him in. It's a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. He was at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be heartier. His niece looked just the same. So did Topper when he came in. So did the plump sister when she came in. So did everyone when they came. Wonderful party. Wonderful games. Wonderful unanimity. Wonderful happiness. But he was at the office early the next morning. Oh, he was there early. If he could only be the first and catch Bob Cratchit coming late, that was the thing he had his heart set upon. And he did. The clock struck 9. No Bob. A quarter past. No Bob. Bob was full 18 minutes and a half behind his time. Scrooge sat with the door wide open that he might see him come into the tent. Bob's hat was off before he opened the door, his comforter too. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock. "Hello?" growled Scrooge in his accustomed voice, as near as he could feign it. "What do you mean, coming in here this time of day?" "I am very sorry, sir. I am behind my time." "You are? Yes, I think you are. Step this way, if you please." "It's only once a year, sir. It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir." I'll tell you what, my friend, I'm not going to stand this sort of thing any longer. And therefore, Scrooge continued, leaping from his stool and giving Bob such a dig in the waistcoat that he staggered back into the tank again. And therefore, I'm about to raise your salary. Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. A Merry Christmas, Bob, said Scrooge, with an earnestness that could not be mistaken, as he clapped him on the back. A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavor to assist your struggling family, and we will discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop, Bob. Make up the fires and buy a second coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit. Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, and as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed at him to see the alteration in him, but his own heart laughed, and that was quite good enough for him. He had no further relations with spirits, but lived in that respect upon the total abstinence principle ever afterwards. And it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be truly said of us, and all of us. And, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, every one.
Thank you all for joining us. I see there's 4 of you now.
That's Aaron.
Oh, it's Bill. I'm glad you all came. Thanks a lot. And yeah, bye now.
Oh, this is
God bless us all.
everyone.
Everyone.